Good morning, everyone. Thank you for getting up on a Saturday morning at the end of the conference when you could be doing other things. I hope at the end of the talk you'll think that it was a good decision. I work in many different pathogen-specific communities and cross-cutting areas, and it really is a pleasure to come to this meeting in particular. It's a really special meeting. I really listened with interest to the discussion about the International RSV Society. I think it really is important that this meeting continues and you figure out how to continue in this way which is enabling collaboration, having one meeting without parallel streams which allow the scientists and the people thinking about the more downstream activities to really engage in discussions is going to be really critical. And just one other point from my side is that one of the reasons why it's so enjoyable to come to these meetings for me is that from WHO's perspective, in addition to the science, the degree of collaboration and the collaborative nature of the work actually really enables progress going forward. So the degree of collaboration that I see in RSV is just really promising. And I'm sure that will continue as you go forward. So I have been working I'm a general vaccinologist with a focus on low and middle income countries. I've lived and worked in North America, in Europe, in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 20 years. And for the last 8 years, I've been at WHO, and I've been deeply engaged in the licensure, international regulatory policy, access issues. So what the role of my team at WHO is to link vaccine development communities with the issues of licensure, pre-qualification and access, and try to shorten timelines. And I think what's so exciting about RSV is that as I'll explain, RSV really is the number one priority in the vaccine pipeline space, the preventive intervention space, because of the process that we went through. And we do have an opportunity now to learn the lessons from the other new interventions, going back to Hib, pneumo, rotavirus, HPV, and more recently malaria and dengue, and try to apply those in ways that can hopefully shorten the timelines. So just in outline, I'm going to go through some of these pathways from my perspective, why both WHO recommendation and pre-qualification are important. So if you take one thing away from this, I would like you to really understand what the difference between those two are and why they're both really very important. How we went through our prioritization and the tracking that we're doing. I have one slide on our position on registration and reporting, and then mainly an update on the total change from WHO's perspective since the meeting in Stellenbosch, where we hadn't had any specific RSV consultations. Now we've had substantial streams of work, and we can report on those. And I think most importantly, the top-level immunization committee, SAGE, which Kate O'Brien here is a member of, reviewed for the first time RSV, and that they were very engaged. And I think it's important to share their perspective. I'd also like to show some slides which actually were sent to me from Gavi at my request when I said I was coming to this meeting, because I think it really is important to begin to think about the differences between regulatory policy, but also financing perspectives. So going beyond initial licensure, obviously you have the national policy recommendation steps, but at WHO, our global equivalent of those national bodies like ACIP, like JCVI in the UK, is SAGE, a group of 15 independent experts. So everything we do at WHO is based on the independent advice that we get from the world's best experts. And you probably would know several of those individuals. In addition to Kate O'Brien, for example, there's Andrew Pollard, who also has been a PI on an RSV vaccine trial, works in the UK. He's currently the chair of the UK Policy Recommendation Committee for Immunisation. There's Claire-Anne Seacrest, a leading vaccine immunologist, and many others that you would know. Now, secondarily, so that's policy recommendation. Quite distinctly, but equally important in a way, is pre-qualification, which is, I've got a couple of slides on that, and really both of them are very important. Both of them will not occur until there is an initial licensure in terms of actually recommendation for use. Pre-qualification depends on licensure by what WHO calls a functional national regulatory authority. But in addition to the licensure from, let's say, FDA, EMA, now there's a number of functional authorities. India and China are now, for example, considered functional, and there's a growing list. There are certain other requirements for pre-qualification. And pre-qualification and recommendation by SAGE are requirements for financing by Gavi. So clearly, going beyond the recommendation stage, financing becomes a critical issue. High-income countries, there will be public, very large-scale public sector financing in high-income countries, private sector as well. For low-income countries, we are very, very fortunate in vaccines in that we have a functional multilateral financing mechanism, which is Gavi, for Gavi-eligible countries. So I'm going, and the reason I say we're fortunate is that in other spaces, in therapeutics, that doesn't exist. HIV, TB, malaria, they fill the therapeutic space with Global Fund and Unitaid to some extent, but in several other areas, that is still a critical barrier for access. We have Gavi, so we need to capitalize on that. And then, of course, country interest is critically important, and that also is highly related to community and policymaker understanding of the burden and their perceived view on community acceptability and sort of political interest to some extent. So there are both data and non-data elements to country interest. So why is pre-qualification important? Well, every year, 2/3 of the world's children receive WHO pre-qualified vaccines. And this goes back to the 1980s, and essentially where there was a real call for an international harmonization of vaccine production standards. And this is the single mechanism that we really have for a global harmonization of vaccine production standards. A simple way to appreciate the importance of this is a quote from the current CEO of Gavi, Seth Berkley, who said that WHO pre-qualification gives assurance to Gavi and others that the vaccines that we buy are safe, effective, and I highlighted suit the needs of developing countries. So that part is different to what the other regulators do. So while PQ builds on licensure and has quality, safety, and efficacy requirements, there's an additional element called programmatic suitability for pre-qualification. And none of this is difficult for you to access. Anyone who's interested, I could point you to all of the documents on our website, but I'm just summarizing the big picture points. If you want to look at what that programmatic suitability guidance is, it's up there on the website. It gets updated. Some key elements there are the presentation. We've had major issues with the presentation with some vaccines that maybe are safe and efficacious, but it has proven difficult to then implement those vaccines in developing countries. Also packaging, cold chain requirements. So there are some questions there where they're not scientifically difficult, and I don't think the technology fixes are difficult either. It's just simply a question of being aware of those needs for programmatic suitability and building them in before you finalize the presentation from the low and middle income country perspective. PQ, as I said, is required for Gavi financing. Gavi is one of the few bodies where the last time they went for replenishment, they got a little bit more than they asked for, and they are, I would say, one of, or the example of a really successful multilateral agency that are seen as a success by donors. And so it's likely they will be able to continue to raise money going forward, but pre-qualification and policy recommendation are necessary. And I already talked about the programmatic suitability. So I hope that's clear, that even if you go to FDA and you get licensure, it really is important to include thinking about separately pre-qualification and policy recommendation. Just one more slide on the regulatory aspects. Something that I think hasn't been highlighted enough, so I try to do this, are what WHO can do to enable regulatory authorization. And there are a couple of distinct ways this can occur. Through pre-qualification. After a vaccine is pre-qualified, there's something called the collaborative procedure, where there's a list of countries where they will come together, and there is no a rigorous process, but based on the initial licensure by a stringent regulatory authority and pre-qualification, that can assist those countries in their assessment process and can shorten timelines. And a good recent example was a meningococcal A monovalent conjugate vaccine that was developed in partnership between PATH and WHO with funding from the Gates Foundation, where after PQ, the collaborative procedure led to licensing in many countries in a very short time. There's also slightly distinctly an alternative, which is this joint review process, which in the last couple of years there are several examples where manufacturers have desired, and it's been in the public health interest, to get joint either clinical trial authorization in a number of countries or moving towards joint assessment for licensure. And there's a team in WHO led by Mike Ward within the Essentials Medicines Department that really are moving forward with expanding the scope of these joint review processes. So if as a manufacturer you are looking to potentially either get clinical trial authorization in a number of countries, or later on potentially licensure in a number of countries, particularly low and middle income countries, we have these networks that they come to us being, I'm speaking for many different parts of WHO here, this team in the Essential Medicines Department. The regulators want to know what is happening with the pipeline. So as part of my work, after going to Stellenbosch 2 years ago and getting up to speed with RSV, I briefed these networks as the new vaccines person. I presented to this developing countries vaccine regulatory network group that includes China, India, South Africa, Brazil, and that this is something, this joint review process is something that I think it's really important that everybody bears in mind as one of the ways that we can try to shorten timelines. For example, so the RTSS malaria vaccine, the entire phase 3 pivotal trial was authorized through this joint review process, where WHO brought all of the regulators together from 7 countries. The questions back to the manufacturers were collated in one from all 7 countries, which certainly enabled the timings for that vaccine. Okay, so another point, and I apologize to those of you who are experts in policy and regulatory matters, but I do want to make this point, because I think it's something that I do see is not always clear to different groups, and that is the difference between the regulatory needs and perspective and the policy needs. There are some types of data that really overlap very much or completely. There are others that are quite distinct, and unless you address both, there really is a risk of potentially major delays in the timelines. So from the regulatory perspective, all of the manufacturers here will be very intimately aware of the regulatory requirements, and yet all have big teams who are with the regulatory team. And there's the quality and the manufacturing consistency elements, which the policy assessment does not do at all. We completely defer the quality assessment to the regulators. Safety is absolutely central from both the regulatory and the policy perspective. There's the efficacy assessment, which is really quite different, I would say, from the regulator's perspective to the policy perspective. Efficacy sometimes is inferred from immunogenicity with the regulators. That I don't think is going to be such an issue in RSV, but that may be more central, for example, in Group B strep, which we're also working on. And then we have the examples of the initial licensure databases, which have tended to vary from 6,000 to 40,000 or so. Only the larger number is only where it was based on a specific safety event of interest in rotavirus. And it may be possible to get lower than 6,000 potentially, but that's the history. From the policy side, I've just underlined the areas that really are not particularly considered by the regulators, but really are very important from the policy perspective. So efficacy, effectiveness, clearly there's quite a different perspective here, because there's a lot of thought about the total effectiveness, indirect effects, what the impact will be, what the effectiveness and impact will be of a vaccine in use in the program. And at the new vaccine stage, you have to look at the pre-licensure data and make some kind of assessment as to how this may translate. So anything that you need larger numbers than you would ever have at the step immediately at licensure, there's a lot of need to look to models, and at the policy discussions there will generally be some modelled impact work, which is actually really can be quite important from the policy side. There's discussions about feasibility of implementation, which are excluded from the regulatory discussions. Similarly, health economic evaluations are really important, and increasingly the countries have more and more options to choose from. So the health economics aspects really, I think, will be increasingly important. The role of the intervention in the context of existing interventions and the broader perspectives. Now, I don't want to stand here and, sound like there's just so much to do that it's sort of too much of a burden. It is possible over a time period to build up the case in all of these different data areas and activity areas. And I think what Sage highlighted is that there's perhaps a 4 to 5 year time period where as would normally the case for a field where you are, where the vaccine development and the science is really exciting, but we don't have a licensed vaccine yet. Some of these elements that I've underlined would always not be so well developed, but we have some time now to work on that. So I'm just briefly going to go through why RSV has been highlighted as the #1 priority in the vaccine pipeline space. So with this committee that we constituted in 2014, which my director, Okwobela, asked me to constitute, the Product Development for Vaccines Advisory Committee, we didn't have any structure to look at the whole landscape of new vaccines and new technologies and try to understand what the status was so that we could prioritize time for our engagement. This doesn't mean that the areas which are further behind in terms of timelines at an earlier stage are less important. It's just that we probably need to spend more of our time on the areas that are getting closer to licensure. So that's very important. So if something isn't on our priority list, it's a priority for our time in areas that we think are getting closer to emerging from the pipeline. So we started with the longest list we could find, which was from the NIH Jordan report in 2012, which listed 110 pathogens, all of which there was some vaccine research going on in, and we identified about 600 candidate vaccine approaches. These are not candidate vaccines, this is an approach. So a DNA vaccines for Zika would be an approach. So there are actually many more candidate vaccines in this that we found. We pre-screened this to some feasible number that we could do global pathogen-specific landscape analyses for. For each one of those, we identified someone that we saw as a world-leading, credible, independent partner to do that landscape analysis for us. Each one of those is published there's a whole issue of vaccine, and now there's a second issue of vaccine, because we're doing more of these now. When we sent the first issue to Stanley Plotkin, he said, "This is great, but you really need to do CMV." So we agreed with him. We're doing CMV. There's a list of other ones that we're adding in. But that journal of vaccine is interesting for those of you who work in product development, because I think it's a resource that is not available anywhere else. They are not academic reviews. They're synthetic product development focused landscape analyses which look at the regulatory pathways, obstacles, barriers, data gaps from the product development perspective. But they also have the tables of all of the vaccines globally. So we then asked this very hard-working group of people, two of whom you would know very well, Ruth Karen and Barney Graham, and the others on this committee are equally leading scientific figures in their field across enterics, viral, bacterial, parasitic diseases. We asked them to rank using 3 simple criteria. What is the unmet public health need, focusing on the low and middle income countries? So this takes into account whether or not there's a perception that there really are existing interventions, and to what extent they meet the need. What is the chance of a product emerging? So for that, we used both the probability of technical and regulatory success, looking at the science and the technical barriers and the regulatory pathways, and the extent of activity and investment in a given area, which it's a little crude, but we couldn't think of a better way to get some idea of the chance of a product emerging, and then specifically, what is the added value of WHO emerging? And the publications that we've put out list the others, and the others would include Group B strep, Group A strep, ETEC, Shigella, and norovirus. But RSV came out, I think, clearly, unanimously by this independent committee which had a lot of people who were not RSV experts on it as the number one. And so that's why over the last couple of years we have moved forward with, started quite a lot of work. So the types of work that we do in my team at WHO, in addition to liaising with other parts and coordinating across WHO and with partners, when you have a new vaccine coming through, you always need a scope of work looking at the key endpoints for vaccine evaluation and case definitions through consensus building. And here, generally, and I think this applies in RSV, what we're interested in is, first of all, the primary endpoint is always going to be decided between the manufacturers and the regulator, often FDA and EMA or both, or maybe somewhere else, depending on where the manufacturer is. And I mean, that's expected and appropriate. But as a second issue, which is that at WHO's assessment, we need to be able to compare the data that is coming out of different trials, different countries, and different products, or the same product over time. And so the comparability becomes very important. And so that's one focus of this work. Secondly, we tend to prioritize specificity over sensitivity in our work, because these are case definitions for use in pivotal preventive intervention trials. So we really think it's important not to underestimate vaccine efficacy through the bias that you can get with low specificity case definition. So that was the way that we looked at this. And I'll come back to this. We are developing what we call preferred product characteristics in each of the two strategic goals that we have for RSV, so I'll get back to that. And we're really increasing the amount of work we're doing in target product profiles, because we think if the community knows what WHO really is looking for, then so far as you want to de-risk the outcomes of the WHO processes, it may be helpful for you to have these kind of documents. That doesn't mean that anybody is expected to develop a vaccine exactly according to ours. You all have to have your own in-house TPPs, but these will hopefully help you from our side. We also previously have developed R&D roadmaps, and the idea is here that you first of all need to have the strategic goals. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What's the public health added value of your intervention? But then within that framework, what are the priority at the global level? What are the priority research activities, product development activities, policy commercialization activities, and capacities? Sometimes there are major sort of capacity issues that come up. And so we can lay those out in a process of consensus with the community, and this is also underway in RSV. And the other thing that has been quite interesting is in some areas you see a vaccine that maybe is coming through, but we have, and it's only being thought about for travelers or high-income countries, but we just don't know what the disease burden is in low-income countries. So sometimes we've started just communicating with our surveillance colleagues that, if you have an enteric or an invasive bacterial disease network, an under 5 network, a network working in different age groups, these are the kinds of pathogens where if you could add these in, it may actually make a real difference to the case for the relative priority of that vaccine. And that dialogue has been really interesting because PDVAC has enabled that kind of dialogue. So one other point, just to let you know that we've started, and this was also really followed from the PDVAC discussions, with this overall vaccine pipeline tracker. So for each one of the diseases, we have either one partner or a number of partners. For RSV, clearly PATH is doing a great job in listing the activity and maintaining activity. PATH have their own snapshot, but we have this standardized format where we ask different pathogen areas. So you can go to this website and you can just click on each of these tabs at the top. And I think this is the one place in the world where we have updated global pipeline activity, including all of the clinical trial registration sites, the start date, the estimated end date, and we're tracking now when the results are reported and whether or not the results are reported, because we have a position that all clinical trials should have a registration site and they should all be reported at some point. So you can go to PATH's site for a more sort of detailed view on RSV, but this is our sort of way of tracking the RSV work. But you can also click through to HIV. We have Zika, dengue, and we have our list of priority emerging pathogens here. So I think that's actually another important resource and probably an underutilized resource, because I don't think our communication, we don't have the resources for communication as some of the other agencies do. So I think that's one of the reasons why I'm here, to try and communicate the kind of resources that we have there. So, next, major difference since the last time I came to an RSV meeting and talked is that we've had WHO meetings where we have asked, and graciously, many of you who I know have gone through this period where suddenly there's quite a few RSV meetings and you have to decide which ones to come to, have prioritized coming to the WHO meetings. So we've had 2 overall RSV vaccine meetings, but other specific work stream meetings related to, we're developing a WHO international standard for RSV neutralization. The RSV surveillance is being added to the influenza surveillance network in a pilot way. So I'm going to briefly go through some of the things that came through. So first of all, we agreed that any vaccine that gets licensed for whatever indication, if it has a potential relevance to WHO, will be assessed and go through the policy process. So this is not to say that if an elderly vaccine for RSV gets licensed, it won't be considered. Absolutely not. But what we're saying here is that the priorities from our perspective, the public health needs, are for preventive interventions, either through maternal immunization or passive immunization, to prevent RSV disease in that window. And the passive there is quite a big deal from our side, because that has driven a whole load of discussions about the fact that really you can give that sort of protection either through transplacental transfer or administration of one of these, for example, a long-acting monoclonal antibody. So we're open to both of those, and in our department we're really thinking of both of those. Secondly, vaccines for active immunization to prevent disease once protection afforded by maternal immunization wanes. So both of these are kind of highlighted as strategic goals for us. So some points that came out here. Data needs will differ for decision-making in high, middle, and low-income settings. Regulators and policymakers from different settings will be looking for data relevant to their own settings, which, for our side, raises the importance of defining endpoints that are relevant to target populations. And we discussed that it is desirable to construct widely applicable endpoints with objective criteria that can be applied in a standardized way across different settings to define severe RSV. I talked about the fact the primary endpoint is agreed between the manufacturer and the regulator. What it comes down to is that if different manufacturers and trials use widely different endpoints and case definitions, we may require additional analyses to be performed and reported to enable comparability. And this is not burdensome. We've done this in both malaria and dengue with GSK and Sanofi. And essentially, as long as the clinical features are identified and the parameters are included, that's the important point from our perspective. And I've been listening to the discussions about endpoints with interest, but that's really what it comes down to. If different types of endpoints are going to be used by the different manufacturers. We clearly need to avoid a scenario where safety and effectiveness is demonstrated, including endpoints that are accruing in low and middle income countries, but the vaccine then becomes available only for high income countries. I think everybody in this room agrees with that, and I think I really hope as a vaccine community we've moved past that. I think we have. So this really does put some onus on the developers and funders to work towards ensuring access and availability in low and middle income countries. And these discussions have been ongoing, and a lot of the discussions at SAGE with the Gates Foundation, with PATH, are happening perhaps at an earlier stage in RSV than they may have happened in some other areas, which is very promising. I wanted to say that in the report from the WHO meeting, there is a specific section on duration of follow-up, which I really would recommend that you look at. It's recommended that the frequency and severity of illness and the pattern of immune response be monitored through the second season. Extended follow-up may be considered in the post-marketing surveillance periods with a specific focus on the impact of immunization on long-term wheezing. So this came up at the SAGE meeting as well, and I just think it's risky, really, in a pivotal trial not to include follow-up during the second season, because there will be questions, certainly at the policy stage, not so much, regulators often accept 12 months of follow-up if there are enough events, but there certainly will be questions from the policy perspective. And I also would say that in my work with other areas, whatever you can do with RCT data, the observational studies are important, but whatever can be done to answer questions using future or existing RCT data is really important. I'm going to go through some of this because I think actually the SAGE recommendations cover some of the same issues, but I already said that we've really identified this issue of the long-acting single-dose monoclonal antibody and other monoclonal antibodies as a real shift in that these seem to be coming through, and with, depending on how the pricing goes, these may be really very relevant to WHO. And so this has triggered a lot of internal discussions because there are no pre-qualified monoclonal antibodies, but we need to put that in place. I was asked just to show you one slide about where we are with the biosimilar project for Pali. So this is under development at Mab Science. The expected approval date is in 2020 with EMA. It's a partnership between a group in Utrecht and 4 LMIC manufacturers. The target population is the premature and the full term with congenital heart disease. And I'm not working on this, but what I was asked to convey is there's a couple of questions. Will this be competitive with a future MedImmune single dose, long-acting? We're not sure, but it's proceeding based on the fact that we can't take the risk of assuming that the product will necessarily continue to be available. And then the other issue with maternal vaccines is, I guess there may be a role in that with very premature births, they may not always benefit from maternal vaccination. I'll just say that the RSV surveillance is starting, and there's a lot of discussions about how to move forward, but we have pilots in 14 countries with addition to the influenza system, but a lot of discussions about how to move forward further. There is an international standard now in development which will allow really add to your comparability between different neutralization assays. And that is building on work from PATH that was presented previously, and there's a big collaborative study assessing candidate reagents that can be worked up into an international standard so that neutralization assays can actually be reported in international units when all of this goes through. In terms of SAGE, I think I won't actually go through all of these because for time, but this is on the website. But a couple of the points are that they identified some data gaps, which I think are not new to any of you, and it may help you to actually just look at the wording from the SAGE report if you haven't seen it. They also really highlighted this fact of mobilizing resources to follow up subjects from RCTs to evaluate the long-term effects of RSV interventions. If this relationship can be established between prevention of RSV and asthma, I mean, I know you all know this, but it would totally transform, I'm really convinced, what is perceived as the value of RSV vaccines. They talked about the work that needs to happen to really prepare for global policy making, and that is leading to a lot of discussions with those kind of groups. They talked about the pre-qualification pathways for long-acting monoclonal antibodies, which is ongoing. They talked about the need for cost-effectiveness and impact modeling data, and some important considerations for doing that cost-effectiveness work. This is one important point, I think. They also specifically pointed out that they're very supportive of clinical trials in pregnant women to enable the development of potentially life-saving interventions such as RSV vaccine and Group B strep vaccine. So if there are real problems with enrolling for clinical trials in pregnant women, I would like to know about that, because we really need to work to see if we can enable that by the ethics structure. And I've already talked about the fact that they highlighted this 4 to 5 year time period. So just very, very briefly, Gavi. So as you know, we have this existing financing agency. They were most recently replenished with $7.5 billion. These are their previous commitments and investments. The main point is that every 5 years they go through a process to decide what they are going to commit to ahead of time. And the next one is coming up in 2018. The one after that will be 2023. And they're going to have to decide between all of the different possibilities depending on how much money they think they can actually raise. So RSV is going to go into this pot, and they're already thinking about this. These are slides from Gavi, and by interacting with us, they came to the RSV meeting. They've started thinking about what the data needs are going to need to be to make the case for RSV to go into this consideration. The process starts with WHO providing a long list and obviously RSV will be on there. And then it goes through various assessment processes. There's 2 phases where in the first phase there's a shortlist that's decided upon by the board. The shortlist then, when the board meets twice a year, the shortlist goes into very detailed assessments, and then there's a final decision. The criteria that they use going forward are going to be very important, because I think it's fair to say that in the past, mortality has been a predominant feature. However, it's important to realize that morbidity and several other criteria, including epidemic potential and several others, are on there. So exactly how they choose to weigh these, I think, will be important. In our dialogue with them, we have been discussing the fact that, I think more and more it's not going to be really appropriate to focus too much on mortality. Mortality is very, very important, but we have more and more interventions coming through which may have very substantial morbidity gains. So that's an ongoing discussion. And this is just some of the things that they're going to have to think about. So I have 2 conclusion slides. We've heavily engaged. We have lots of work streams ongoing. You have, as a community, the opportunity to make the case for investment as these vaccines proceed. The decisions on resources, will be made in comparison between RSV and other pathogen areas. The data needs for introduction overlap with, but are distinct from the needs for licensure. And now is the time to consider how best to address policy as well as regulatory considerations. I'd just like to acknowledge all of our committee members, everybody who came to our meetings, Garvey for their slides, many people in our team, and also the Gates Foundation for their support. This is the World Health Assembly. So I put this up to say that we're moving in the next time period 5 to 10 years to RSV really being on the agenda at this level. This is the Ministry of Health of everybody in the world. And at the moment, the way RSV is at this kind of level at the World Health Assembly is through the Global Vaccine Action Plan, where there are 5 objectives. One of those objectives is develop new vaccines and technologies and get them into use for public health benefits. So I hope that's an interesting perspective for you. And I probably have run over, so I don't know if we'll have time for questions, but I just wanted to stop here. This is what is written over the top of when the people walk out into Centre Court in Wimbledon. This is Roger Federer. You'd know this Kipling poem, if you could meet with triumph and disaster and treat those 2 impostors just the same. So as we go along this path, there's going to be moments of triumph and great disaster, apparent disaster, and the important thing will be to keep moving along with long, medium and short-term strategies, and we'll get there. Thank you.